Hi, I'm Jared Hardner. This presentation is about biodiversity impact mitigation planning to achieve compliance with the 2019 update of Performance Requirement 6 of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or PR6 for short. This presentation is part of a series that walks the viewer through all stages of developing an environmental impact study and mitigation plan that will comply with PR6. Viewers should also consult the 2020 guidance note for PR6 available on the web. PR6 lays out specific mitigation requirements for priority biodiversity features, critical habitats, and ecosystem services. The broader goal of these requirements is to achieve no net loss of priority biodiversity features and a net gain in critical habitats. Impacts to ecosystem services should be avoided, minimized, and restored. Of course, the client should agree with EBRD on a threshold for materiality of impacts to determine when no net loss or net gain requirements apply. For example, a wind farm might develop a threshold for incidental mortalities of non-threatened bird species, or a project may be allowed incidental impacts to a very small area of common vegetation, for which no net loss requirements are not applied. The mitigation plan should follow a hierarchy of actions, which follows in order of preferability. The result will be to achieve the goals set out in PR6 of no net loss or net gain. The client should achieve its mitigation targets by avoiding impacts wherever feasible, followed by minimization actions. Where impacts do occur, restoration may be proposed. The residual impacts, after these measures are considered, can in some cases be compensated with a biodiversity offset or other means of compensation in the case of impacts to ecosystem services. Let's walk through some examples. Avoidance. These are actions taken to fully prevent impacts, such as relocating a project or changing its spatial layout to prevent impacts in specific locations. Minimization. These are actions taken to reduce the duration, intensity, and/or extent of impacts that cannot be completely avoided. This might include some of the examples shown here, such as wildlife overpasses on roads to reduce mortality from collisions, bird flight diverters on electrical transmission lines, and protocols for preventing the free spinning of wind turbines when not generating electricity. Here's a special topic that requires each of the first three stages of the mitigation hierarchy. Invasive alien species are non-native species that may spread rapidly by outcompeting other native plants and animals when they are introduced into a new habitat that lacks natural controlling factors. Invasive alien species are recognized to be a major global threat to biodiversity and ecosystem services. The principal measures for controlling invasive alien species are A. Prevention of their intentional and unintentional introduction, B. Early detection and eradication, and C. Management to prevent their spread where they are already established. EU Regulation 1143/2014 sets out requirements for member states and is accompanied by an official list of invasive alien species of union concern. Clients in non-member countries should not intentionally introduce invasive alien species and should establish controls to prevent their unintentional introduction and/or spread where this is a risk, even if such an introduction is not forbidden by the host country regulatory framework. In the absence of adequate knowledge regarding the invasiveness of alien species, a risk assessment should be conducted in coordination with competent professionals with knowledge in the species in question. Examples of project types that pose a risk of unintentional spreading of invasive species include linear infrastructure such as roads, rails, pipelines, and transmission lines, projects handling large volumes of international cargo, ports and shipping via ballast water. In areas where invasive species may pose a risk to priority biodiversity features or critical habitats, baseline studies should include a summary of invasive species already present in the project study area, and mitigation and monitoring plans should seek to prevent, detect, and eradicate invasive species during the life of the project, including those already present in the area. A dedicated invasive species plan may be appropriate in these cases. Linear infrastructure projects should include regular monitoring and eradication of invasive species that may use the right-of-way as a corridor for spreading. Projects with international cargo may be subject to national regulations for inspection and quarantine. If not, voluntary measures may be needed. Clients are expected to comply with the International Convention for the Control and Management of Ships' Ballast Water and Sediments. Clients should also refer to guidelines for the control and management of ships' ballast water to minimize the transfer of harmful aquatic organisms and pathogens, published by the International Maritime Organization. Restoration. These are actions taken to assist in the recovery of a feature that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Pictured here is a habitat restoration program that involves the propagation of native species in a nursery, followed by planting in degraded areas with close follow-up monitoring. It is important to understand that such a restoration program requires the collection of germplasm, development of site-specific techniques, and the cultivation of plants, all of which can take a number of years. Therefore, a program like this must begin years before on-the-ground site restoration is undertaken. And finally, offsets. This is the most recently introduced component of the mitigation hierarchy. The technical definition of an offset is, quote, measurable conservation outcomes resulting from actions designed to compensate for significant residual adverse biodiversity impacts arising from project development and persisting after appropriate avoidance, minimization, and restoration measures have been taken. These are effectively off-site restoration and conservation projects. Let's dive into this a bit more. The core principles of biodiversity offsets are A. Deliver conservation gains beyond those that would have occurred in the absence of the offset. B. Conserve biodiversity features that are the same as, or in some cases of higher conservation priority than, those impacted by the planned development. And C. Generate conservation benefits that endure as long as the residual impact of the project. Biodiversity offsets can take the form of conservation projects that restore and protect areas degraded by impacts unrelated to the planned development, or that avert the loss of biodiversity from impacts also unrelated to the planned development. Offset design should secure broad stakeholder support when seeking to conserve features different than those impacted. Just to remind you, the purpose of introducing an offset is to allow a project to achieve no net loss or a net gain after taking all the other feasible mitigation actions. The expected outcome of the entire mitigation plan should be documented in a loss-gain analysis that illustrates the net balance of residual impacts and gains from offsets. The rigor of the analysis will be commensurate to the risk, ranging from qualitative expert opinion in low-risk scenarios to in-depth quantitative analysis, performed by specialists for scenarios where risks are higher. The outcome of mitigating impacts to ecosystem services should be documented in accordance with Performance Requirement 5 and, where applicable, Performance Requirement 7. A loss-gain analysis must be specific to the biodiversity features impacted by the planned development. There is no single method that can be applied in all cases. However, some basic principles apply. The units of measure for impact assessment must be consistent with those for measuring the benefits of a biodiversity offset. They should reflect both the quantity and quality of the feature. For example, if a threatened species habitat is measured, its extent as well as its quality relative to the species' optimal habitat requirements are important to consider. In this case, quality, or Q, might be expressed as a coefficient ranging from 0 to 1, multiplied by the area, for example, hectares, providing the unit of measure quality hectares, or QHA. Using this metric, a loss-gain calculation depicting a net gain would look like the example shown here, where a residual impact of 75 quality hectares is less than the benefit of the offset, which is 125 quality hectares. Notice how the two factors, quality and area, are used in each equation to achieve these results. For projects with potential to generate significant negative impacts on critical habitats, and their features, supporting analyses require a higher degree of rigor. It must be demonstrated that the project will not jeopardize the viability of the critical habitat or the feature it supports within the ecologically appropriate area of analysis, and that the national or global populations of endangered or critically endangered species, depending on the relevant criterion for critical habitat designation, will not decline to a degree that affects the persistence of that species over many generations. Such effects could occur, for example, in situations where a mitigation plan heavily relies on restoration that takes years to come to fruition, and the temporal loss of that habitat may not be tolerated by a highly threatened species that relies on it. In these cases, the project may need to be redesigned. In cases where targeted mitigation is needed for a particular threatened species, it may be appropriate to document it in a standalone species action plan. Some plan development may have the potential, without mitigation, to generate non-offsetable impacts. A non-offsetable impact jeopardizes the viability of the feature at a national or global level. Clear examples of this would be a project that impacts an EAAA that fits the designation criteria for an Alliance for Zero Extinction site, or a UNESCO Natural World Heritage site. EBRD cannot finance development with non-offsetable impacts, so all options for redesign to avoid such residual impacts should be explored. Biodiversity is inherently complex, and there is often uncertainty in impact assessment and mitigation planning. This uncertainty can be managed to some degree by taking a precautionary approach and through monitoring and adaptive management. A biodiversity monitoring and evaluation plan should be practical and inform management decisions. The plan serves two core purposes: A, to confirm that impact assessments were accurate, and B, to ensure that mitigation is functioning as planned. As such, the monitoring plan is essential for adaptive management. A plan should contain several key pieces of information: baseline values for priority biodiversity features, the current status of those features as monitored periodically, the trend of that status, for example, declining, stable, improving, performance thresholds for the current status that triggers a change in mitigation needed to ensure that PR6 requirements will be met, and lastly, a description of alternative mitigation that will be implemented if thresholds are crossed. These options may change over time due to knowledge gained through experience or changing conditions. Adaptive management is a generally misused term. In its original form, it is a controlled experimental design. In current industry parlance, it is very common that adaptive management is misunderstood to mean, quote, "we will decide later." This is wrong. An adaptive management plan should have structure and definition. It's not just a fancy word for trial and error. An adaptive management plan should work like this. When values negatively change from baseline levels, a threshold may be crossed. If it does, a backup mitigation plan must be implemented to achieve the desired level of environmental performance. The threshold should be predefined, and the backup plan should be identified and designed at the outset of the project. These important details should not be left off until they are needed, in particular because it should be known in advance whether or not there is a practical and viable mitigation alternative. For more information on biodiversity mitigation planning, see Good Practices for Biodiversity Inclusive Impact Assessment and Management Planning, developed by the Multilateral Financial Institutions Biodiversity Working Group, and available on EBRD's website. A cross-sector guide for implementing the mitigation hierarchy, developed by the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative and available on their website, and the World Bank's guidance on biodiversity offsets, available on the World Bank website. You can also visit us on the web at www.hg-llc.com. Thanks for your time, and good luck.